Can an average American do it too? Well, that's exactly what you're going to learn about in this book. Plus, after you get the book, you get access to a free bonus video training where I'll show you how I build digital real estate as well as a blueprint for how you can apply this to your life. So make sure you watch that entire video. So with that said, click the link on your screen, enter your email address, and I'll send you a free copy of the book right now. Plus, you'll also get the free bonus training on how to apply it to your life.
Supply followed. But the sample that arrived on Bozenko's desk that day in 2006 was not made from ephedrine, which was growing harder to come by as both the US and Mexico clamped down on it. There was another way to make methamphetamine. Before the ephedrine method had been discovered, the other method had been used by the Hells Angels and other biker gangs, which had dominated a much smaller meth trade in the 80s. Its essential chemical was a clear liquid called phenyl-2-propanone, P2P. Many combinations of chemicals could be used to make P2P. Most of these chemicals were legal, cheap, and toxic. Cyanide, lye, mercury, sulfuric acid, hydrochloric acid, nitrostyrene. The P2P process of making meth was complicated and volatile. The bikers' cooking method gave off a smell so rank that it could only be done in rural or desert outposts, and the market for their product was limited. Bozenko tinkered with his sample for 2 or 3 days. He realized it had been made with the P2P method, which he had not seen employed. Still, that was not the most startling aspect of the sample. There was something else about those few grams that, to Bozenko, heralded a changed world.
Are you looking for a luxury rehab center where insurance can cover up to 100% of your 28-day treatment?
No, I wasn't actually looking for that right now.
Among the
Tell you
drawbacks
the truth,
of the P2P
motherfucker.
method is that it produces 2 kinds of methamphetamine. One is known as D-methamphetamine, which is the stuff that makes you high. The other is L-methamphetamine, which makes the heart race but does little to the brain. It is a waste product. Most cooks would likely want to get rid of the L-meth if they knew what it was, but separating the two is tricky, beyond the skills of most clandestine chemists. And without doing so, the resulting drug is inferior to ephedrine-based meth. It makes your heart hammer without offering as potent a high. Bozenko's sample contained mostly D-methamphetamine. Someone had removed most of the L-meth. I've taken down labs in several continents, Bozenko told me years later. No one in the criminal world, as far as he and his colleagues knew, had ever figured out how to separate D-meth from L-meth before. Back in the late 80s and 90s, when the ephedrine method had taken over, the market for meth had grown because of ephedrine's availability, and because the substance could be transformed into meth with ease and efficiency. All you had to do was tweak the ephedrine molecule, and doing that required little more than following a recipe. But you had to have ephedrine. The P2P method offered traffickers one huge advantage. The chemicals that could be used to make it were also used in a wide array of industries, among them racing fuel, tanning, gold mining, perfume, and photography. Law enforcement couldn't restrict all these chemicals the way it had with ephedrine, not without damaging legitimate sectors of the economy. And a trained organic chemist could make P2P the essential ingredient in many ways. It was impossible to say how many methods of making P2P a creative chemist might come up with. Bozenko counted a dozen or so at first. He put them up in a large diagram on his office wall and kept adding post-it notes with new ones as they appeared. As Bozenko dissected that sample in 2006, its implications hit him. Drugs made in a lab were not subject to weather or soil or season, only to chemical availability. With this new method and full access to the world's chemical markets through Mexican shipping ports, traffickers could ramp up production of P2P meth in quantities that were, effectively, limitless. Even so, Bozenko couldn't have anticipated just how widely the meth epidemic would reach some 15 years later, or how it would come to interact with the opioid epidemic, which was then gaining force. And he couldn't know how strongly it would contribute to related scourges now very much evident in America, epidemics of mental illness and homelessness that year by year are growing worse. A few months after Bozenko's discovery, on December 15, 2006, in a town named Tlajomulco de Zúñiga, in the central Mexican state of Jalisco, a methamphetamine lab exploded. Firefighters responded to the blaze at a warehouse where plastic dinnerware had once been made. No one was hurt in the fire, nor was anyone arrested. But a fire chief called the local DEA office. Abe Perez supervised the DEA's Guadalajara office back then. The warehouse stood on a cul-de-sac at the end of the house-lined street. Perez, who is now retired, remembered years later. Residents knew something was going on. The smells were giving them headaches, Perez told me. But they were afraid to say anything, so they lived with it as best they could until the warehouse exploded, most likely because of a worker's carelessness. Perez and his agents urged Mexican police and prosecutors to obtain a search warrant for the building. The process was slow, and the day ended with no warrant. That night, another fire erupted at a warehouse across the street that, the agents learned, contained chemicals in blue plastic barrels and in bags neatly stacked on pallets. The traffickers came in the middle of the night with gasoline and burned it. Burned all the evidence, Perez said. But we were able to get photos of the place. Eduardo Chavez, another DEA agent, flew in from Mexico City the next afternoon. He and Perez stood outside the second smoldering warehouse. Each man had spent the early part of his career busting meth labs in rural California. Chavez in the area around Bakersfield, Perez in northeastern San Diego County. That had been a different era, and each had gotten a rare view into it. Bakersfield was Chavez's first assignment in 2000, and to his surprise, it was a hotbed of meth production. Southern California was where the ephedrine-based method had been rediscovered, largely due to the efforts of an ingenious criminal named Donald Stenger. Stenger died in 1988 in custody in San Diego County after a packet of meth he'd inserted in his rectum broke open. But the ephedrine method had by then become more widely known and adopted by Mexican traffickers moving up and down the coast between Mexico and California. The Mexican meth industry had been pioneered in that earlier time by two brothers, Luis and Jesus Amezcua. They came to California illegally as kids and eventually ran an auto shop near San Diego. The story goes that a local meth cook dropped by their shop in about 1988, asking Jesus if he could bring in ephedrine from Mexico. Jesus at the time was smuggling Colombian cocaine, but he brought ephedrine north, and with that became attuned to the market that had been opened by Stenger's innovation. Ephedrine was then an unregulated chemical in Mexico. Within a few years, the Amezcuas were importing tons of it. Jesus traveled to India and Thailand, where he set up an office to handle his ephedrine exports. Later, his focus shifted to China and the Czech Republic. The Amezcuas' meth career lasted about a decade, until cases brought against them landed them in a Mexican prison, where they remain. But the brothers marked a new way of thinking among Mexican traffickers. They were more interested in business deals and alliances than in the vengeance and endless shootouts so common to the previous generation of smugglers, who had trafficked mostly marijuana and cocaine. The Amezcuas were the first Mexican traffickers to understand the profit potential of a synthetic drug, and the first to tap the global economy for chemical connections. At first, the brothers ran labs on both sides of the border. They set up many in California's rural Central Valley, Eduardo Chavez's territory, making use of an existing network of traffickers among the truckers and migrant farm workers that stretched up from San Diego. At one bust, agents found a man in protective garments with an air tank on his back. He turned out to be a veterinarian from Michoacan, who said he came up for 4-month stints to teach the workers to cook. Hell's Angels cooks took 3 days to make 5 pounds of meth. Mexican crews soon learned to arrive at cook sites like NASCAR pit crews, with pre-measured chemicals, large vats, and seasoned workers. They produced 10 to 15 pounds per cook in 24 hours in what came to be known as super labs. Soon the biker gangs were buying their meth from the Mexicans. But toward the end of Chavez's Bakersfield assignment in 2004, the cooks and workers who'd been coming up from Mexico began to vanish. His informants told him that they were heading home. In California, law enforcement had made things hard. The job was getting too risky. The chemicals too hard to come by. The meth cook migration would accelerate after Chavez left the state in 2004. Meth lab seizures in the United States withered, from more than 10,000 that year to some 2,500 in 2008. Today in the United States, they are rare, and super labs are practically non-existent. In Mexico, however, it was a different story. The burned-down lab being surveyed by Chavez and Perez at the end of 2006 had been designed to produce industrial quantities of meth. Like many other labs that had been popping up in Mexico, it reflected the union of substantial capital and little concern for law enforcement. It used expensive equipment and stored large inventories of chemicals awaiting processing. Notes found on the scene suggested that the cooks typically got about 240 pounds per batch. Like Joe Bozenko, the agent standing at the edge of the smoke and the stench that afternoon felt that they were glimpsing a new drug world. What struck them both was what they were not seeing: noephedrine. The lab was set up exclusively to make P2P meth. What's more, this lab was not hidden up in the mountains or on a rural ranch. Tlajomulco de Zúñiga lies just 15 miles south of Guadalajara, one of Mexico's largest cities, and serves as home to the city's international airport.
Did you know you can rebuild bad gums and stop tooth decay with a strange herb that's hiding in your fridge? It gets rid of bad breath, gingivitis, and bleeding gums, and has nothing to do with daily oral hygiene or expensive dental treatment. More than 137,000 other men and women use this herb every day. Now they've repaired their gums and their teeth are whiter than ever. This simple herb can reverse your gum disease as well, and will give you strong white teeth in next to no time. That's not an exaggeration. Stop everything you're doing and click the link below or to the top right to watch a short free special video that shows you how this herb rebuilds healthy gums fast. And no, this has nothing to do with brushing your teeth, implants, or trips to the dentist, and it works for everyone. It has worked so shockingly well that the greedy CEOs in the dental industry are scrambling to keep this simple gum-restoring herb hidden to protect their billions in yearly revenues. When you add this tasty herb each morning, you'll get rid of tooth decay, gum disease, and bad breath. That'll happen faster than you ever thought possible. So click the blue Watch Now button below to learn more about this incredible breakthrough. Do that now before the greedy dental companies take it down. Do not miss out on this life-changing opportunity.
The area has everything needed to be a center of meth manufacturing: warehouses, transportation hubs, proximity to chemists. Trucks rumble through the area daily from the shipping ports in Lázaro Cárdenas in the state of Michoacán and Manzanillo in the state of Colima. The ephedrine method was still very much in use in 2006. Mexico, which had been reducing legal imports of ephedrine, wouldn't ban them outright until 2008. Even after that, some traffickers relied on illegal shipments for a time. And despite all the advances when it came to making P2P, in at least some respects the traffickers didn't know what they were doing yet, Chavez told me. The explosion showed that. Nonetheless, years later, he thought back on that moment and realized that it was almost as if they were witnessing a shift right then, that week. About 5 years after the Tlajomulco lab exploded, in June 2011, Mexican authorities discovered a massive P2P meth lab in the city of Querétaro, just a few hours north of Mexico City. It was in a warehouse that could have fit a 737 in an industrial park with roads wide enough for 18-wheelers. It made the Tlajomulco lab look tiny. Joe Bozenko and his colleague Steve Toski were called down from Washington to inspect it, and they wandered through it in awe. Bags of chemicals were stacked 30 feet high. Hundreds of those bags contained a substance neither Bozenko nor Toski had ever thought could be used to make P2P. Bozenko often consulted a book that outlined chemicals that might serve as precursors to making methamphetamine, but this particular substance wasn't in it. Well-trained organic chemists were clearly improvising new ways to make the ingredients, expanding potential supply even further. Working through all the chemicals in the plant, by Bozenko's estimation, the lab could have produced 900 metric tons of methamphetamine. Against the wall stood 3 1,000-liter reactors, 2 stories tall. Nothing like this had been achieved with ephedrine, nor could it have been. No one would have imagined the accumulation of 900 metric tons of the chemical. Later, Mexican investigators would report that of the 16 workers arrested at the Querétaro lab, 14 died over the next 6 months from liver failure, presumably caused by exposure to chemicals at the lab. Methamphetamine was having a cultural moment in the U.S. Meth mouth had become an object of can't-look-away fascination on the internet, and Breaking Bad was big. The switch from ephedrine-based labs to ones using P2P method was even a plot point in the series. But few people outside the DEA really understood the consequences of this shift. Soon, tons of P2P meth were moving north without any let-up, and the price of meth collapsed. But there was more to the story than higher volume. Ephedrine meth tended to damage people gradually, over years. With the switch over to P2P meth, that damage seemed to accelerate, especially damage to the brain. One night in 2009, in Temecula, California, partway between San Diego and LA, a longtime user of crystal meth named Eric Barrera felt the dope change. Barrera is a stocky ex-Marine who'd grown up in the LA area. The meth he had been using for several years by then made him talkative and euphoric. His scalp tingle. But that night, he was gripped with paranoia. His girlfriend, he was sure, had a man in her apartment. No one was in the apartment, she insisted. Barrera took a kitchen knife and began stabbing a sofa, certain the man was hiding there. Then he stabbed a mattress to tatters, and finally he began stabbing the walls, looking for this man he imagined was hiding inside. That had never happened before, he told me when I met him years later. Barrera was hardly alone in noting a change. Gang member friends from his old neighborhood took to calling the meth that had begun to circulate in the area around that time weirdo dope. Barrera had graduated from high school in 1998 and joined the Marine Corps. He was sent to Camp Lejeune in North Carolina, where he was among the few non-white Marines in the platoon. The racism he felt was threatening and brazen. He asked for a transfer to Camp Pendleton in San Diego County and was denied. Over the next year and a half, he said it got worse. 2 years into his service, he was honorably discharged. After the September 11th, 2001 terrorist attacks, Barrera was filled with remorse that he hadn't stuck it out in the Corps. He was home now, without the heroic story he'd imagined for himself when he joined the Marines. The way he tells it, he drank and used meth to relieve his depression. He'd sometimes stay up on meth for 4 or 5 days, and he had to make excuses for missing work. But until that point, he'd held his life together. He worked as a loan processor, then for an insurance company. He had an apartment, a souped-up Acura Integra, a lot of friends. But as the meth changed around 2009, so did Barrera's life. His cravings
love
for
you,
meth
baby.
continued, but paranoia and delusions
I
began to
love
fill his
you. What
days.
you doing, honey?
Those feelings of being chatty and wanting to talk go away, he told me. All of a sudden you're stuck and you're in your head and you're there for hours. He said strange things to people. He couldn't hold the job. No one tolerated him for long. His girlfriend, then his mother, then his father, followed by a string of friends who had welcomed him because he always had drugs. When he described his hallucinations, my friends were like, I don't care how much dope you got, you can't stay here. By 2012, massive quantities of meth were flowing into Southern California. That same year, 96% of meth samples tested by DEA chemists were made using the P2P method. And for the first time in more than a decade of meth use, Barrera was homeless. He slept in his car, and for a while, in abandoned houses in Bakersfield. He was hearing voices. A Veterans Affairs psychologist diagnosed him with depression and symptoms of schizophrenia. Even many years later, when I spoke with him, Barrera didn't know how the drug he was using had changed and spread, or why. But as a resident of Southern California, he was among the first to be affected by it. Over the next half-dozen years or so, the flood of P2P meth would spread east, immersing much of the rest of the country too. Mention drug running, and many people will think of cartels. Yet over the past decade, meth's rising availability did not result from the dictates of some underworld board of directors. Something far more powerful was at work, particularly in the Sinaloa area, a massive, unregulated free market. By the time Eric Barrera's life began to collapse, something like a Silicon Valley of meth innovation, knowledge, skill, and production had formed in the states along Mexico's northern Pacific coast. The deaths of kingpins who had controlled the trade in the early 2010s had only accelerated the process. When the control vanishes, all these regional fiefdoms spring up, said a DEA supervisor who pursued Mexican trafficking organizations during these years. He, like some other DEA agents I spoke with, asked that his name not be used because of the dangerous nature of his work. We just started seeing more and more labs springing up everywhere. The new labs weren't all as enormous as the Querétaro lab that Bozenko had seen in 2011, but they multiplied quickly. Beginning in about 2013 and continuing for the next several years, meth production expanded geometrically. The labs just escape all limits, a member of the Sinaloan drug world told me. In a 5 square kilometer area outside Culiacan, Sinaloa's capital city, there were like 20 labs, no exaggeration. You go out to 15 kilometers, there's more than 100. Listening to traffickers on wiretaps, one DEA agent told me, made it clear just how loose the confederations of meth suppliers were by then. The cartels had not vanished, and many of these suppliers were likely paying one or another of them off. But the wires nonetheless revealed a pulsing ecosystem of independent brokers, truckers, packagers, pilots, shrimp boat captains, mechanics, and tire shop owners. In the United States, the system included meat plant workers, money wiring services, restaurants, farm foremen, drivers, safe houses, and used car lots. The ecosystem harnessed the self-interest of each of these actors, who got paid only when deals got done. We raced hours listening on the wire, the agent told me. to people wasting their time calling around doing the networking as brokers, trying to set up drug deals because they wanted to make money. There's a huge layer of brokers who are the driving force in Mexican drug trafficking. Maybe they own a business or a restaurant in Mexico or in the US. This is something they do to supplement income. A large percentage of drug deals at this level don't happen, but it's like salesmen. The more calls you make, the more people you know, the more sales you get. So 4 or 5 people will be involved in getting 50 kilos to some city in the United States. This guy knows a guy who knows a guy who has a cousin in Atlanta. And with the independent transporters operating at the border, there's no cartel allegiance. They're all just making money. From 2015 to 2019, the Mexican military raided some 330 meth labs in Sinaloa alone. But arrests were rare, according to a person involved in targeting the labs. Far from being a deterrent, the raids showed that no one would pay a personal price, and more people entered the trade as a result. At one point in 2019, DEA intelligence held that, despite all the raids, at least 70 meth labs were operating in Sinaloa, each with the capacity to make tons of meth with every cook. With labs popping up everywhere, the price of a pound of meth fell to nearly $1,000 for the first time on U.S. streets by the late 2010s, a 90% drop from a decade earlier in many areas. Yet traffickers' response to tumbling prices was to increase production, hoping to make up for lower prices with higher volume. Competition among producers also drove meth purity to record highs. Pot was part of this story too. As some American states legalized marijuana, Mexican pot revenue faltered. Many producers switched to making meth and found it liberating. Marijuana took months to grow, was bulky, and could rot. But with crystal meth, the member of the Sinaloan drug world told me, in 10 days, you've made it. It's not as bulky as pot, so in 2 weeks, you're crossing the border with it. Within 2 or 3 months, you're big. In the Southwest, the drug quickly became more prevalent than ever, and supply kept flowing east, covering the country in meth all the way to New England, which had almost none before the mid-2010s. Since late 2016, the Midwest and South have seen an especially dramatic shift. Mexican traffickers have never been able to get their hands on enough ephedrine to cover those regions. But now that was no longer an issue. In place after place, they made alliances with local dealers to introduce their product. The Louisville, Kentucky area is one example. For years, Louisville had a paltry meth market. A pound of it sold for $14,000. Then Wiley Greenhill went to prison. Greenhill was a minor drug dealer in Detroit who had come to Louisville in 1999, attracted by Kentucky's vibrant street market for pain pills, which were fetching 5 times what they sold for in Detroit. He eventually landed at the Rotorua Correctional Complex, north of Louisville, where he struck up a friendship with an inmate from California. The inmate's father, a businessman from Southern California named Jose Prieto, had gone into debt with the wrong people from Sinaloa. The Sinaloans told Prieto that to settle his debt, he had to sell their meth. Greenhill was given the opportunity to buy it. By 2016, Greenhill was out of prison, and the meth began to flow. At first, Prieto sent small quantities through the mail. Soon the loads reached 50 to 100 pounds a month, driven east by women Greenhill hired. Prieto proved eager to get his product out. He fronted Greenhill hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of meth, on the promise that he would be repaid. Tim Fritz, a DEA agent who investigated the Prieto-Greenhill ring, told me, Jose Prieto would say, whatever you need, we got it. Whatever you buy, I'll double it. You want 10 pounds, I'll give you 20. Pay me later. As months passed, the Louisville meth market expanded beyond anything the region had seen before. The trade spread to southern Indiana and nearby counties in Kentucky as the number of customers grew. Other local traffickers began to import meth as well. The price of a pound of meth fell to about $1,200, less than a tenth of what it had been just a few years earlier. At the Moore Center, a Louisville clinic set up to treat pain pill and heroin addicts, patients started coming in on meth. Before the Prieto-Green Hill connection, only 2 of Counselor Jennifer Grzezik's patients were using meth. Within 3 years, almost 90% of new patients coming to the clinic had meth in their drug screen. I don't remember having any homeless people in my caseload before 2016, she told me. But 20% of her clients now are homeless. Greenhill and Prieto were arrested in 2018 and 2019, respectively, and are now serving lengthy federal prison terms. They left behind a transformed market. Primed by the new supply, meth demand has exploded, in turn drawing more dealers who have found their own supply connections. The price of a pound of meth remains low. To compete, some Louisville meth dealers now offer free delivery. Others offer syringes already loaded with liquid meth, so users can immediately shoot up. Similar
Right.
partnerships, arrangements, and retail innovations have transformed regional drug markets across the U.S.
Are you looking for a luxury rehab center where insurance can cover up to 100% of your 28-day treatment?
Fuck no.
Come fly out
Fucking
to our
hate
private
rehab.
ranch in Texas.
Habits once entrenched are difficult to change. If they weren't, more Americans would have quit smoking soon after 1964, when the U.S. Surgeon General issued his first report on its risks. American nicotine addicts kept smoking because nicotine had changed their brain chemistry, and cigarettes were everywhere. We stopped people from smoking, argues Wendy Wood, a psychologist at the University of Southern California and the author of a book on habituation, by adding friction to the activity, making it harder to do, or limiting cigarette vending machines, banned smoking in public spaces. By adding friction to smoking, we also removed cues that prompted people to smoke. Bars where booze, friends, and cigarettes went together, for example. Something like the opposite of that has happened with P2P methamphetamine. Meth reminds me of what alcoholics go through. Matt Scharf, the director of recovery programs at Midnight Mission, a Los Angeles treatment center, told me. There's alcohol everywhere. Meth is now so readily available. There's an availability to it that is not the case with heroin or crack. It's everywhere. All of that meth has been pushed into a market already softened up by the opioid epidemic. That should not have mattered. Historically, meth and opioid users have been separate groups with different cultures, and the drugs affect the brain's reward pathways differently. But as large supplies of P2P meth began to arrive, many opioid addicts already feared for their life. Fentanyl, a dangerous synthetic opioid, was also spreading quickly. For many, Suboxone, which blocks opiate receptors and hence eliminates opioid cravings, was a lifesaver. They use it daily, the way a heart patient uses daily blood thinners to stay alive. Yet the counseling and continuum of care required to support the broader life changes necessary for addiction recovery are often absent. Thus, as P2P meth spread nationwide, an unprecedented event took place in American drug use. Opioid addicts began to shift en masse to meth. Meth overdoses have risen rapidly in recent years, but they are much less common than opioid ODs. You don't typically overdose and die on meth. You decay.
No, you don't.
By 2019, in the course of my reporting, I was routinely coming into contact with people in Kentucky, Ohio, Indiana, Tennessee, and West Virginia who were using Suboxone to control their opiate cravings from long-standing addiction to pain pills and heroin, while using methamphetamine to get high. Massive supplies of cheap P2P meth had created a demand for a stimulant out of a market for a depressant. In the process, traffickers forged a new population of mentally ill Americans. Over the past year and a half, I've talked with meth addicts, counselors, and cops around the country. The people I spoke with told me stories nearly identical to Eric Barrera's. P2P meth use was quickly causing steep deterioration in mental health. The symptoms were always similar: violent paranoia, hallucinations, conspiracy theories, isolation, massive memory loss, jumbled speech. Methamphetamine is a neurotoxin. It damages the brain no matter how it is derived. But P2P meth seems to create a higher order of cerebral catastrophe. I don't know that I would even call it meth anymore. Ken Vick, the director of a drug treatment center in Kansas City, Missouri, told me. Schizophrenia and bipolar disorder are afflictions that begin in the young. Now people in their 30s and 40s with no prior history of mental illness seem to be going mad. Portland, Oregon began seeing the flood of meth around 2013. By January 2020, the city had to close its downtown sobering station. The station had opened in 1985 as a place for alcoholics to sober up for 6 to 8 hours, but it was unequipped to handle people addicted to P2P meth. The degree of mental health disturbance, the wave of psychosis, the profound disorganization is something I've never seen before. Rachel Solotaroff, the CEO of Central City Concern, the social service nonprofit that ran the station, told me. Solotaroff was among the first people I spoke with. She sounded overwhelmed. If they're not raging and agitated, they can be completely non-communicative. Treating addiction relies on your ability to have a connection with someone. But I've never experienced something like this, where there's no way into that person. On Skid Row in Los Angeles, crack had been the drug of choice for decades. Dislodging it took some time, but by 2014, the new meth was everywhere. When that happened, it seemed that people were losing their minds faster. A Los Angeles Police Department beat officer named Dion Joseph told me. Joseph had worked Skid Row for 22 years. They'd be okay when they were just using crack, Joseph said. Then in 2014, with meth, all of a sudden they became mentally ill. They deteriorated into mental illness faster than I ever saw with crack cocaine.
I'm excited. I got a package from Humans.
This is Live Humans product, Super Beats, circulation superfood that supports healthy blood
I
pressure.
got the Super Beat powder. Helps with circulation, superfood.
Susan Partovi has been a physician for homeless people in Los Angeles since 2003. She noticed increasing mental illness, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder at her clinics around the city, starting in about 2012. She was soon astonished by how many severely mentally ill people were out there, Partovi told me. Now almost everyone we see when we do homeless outreach on the streets is on meth. Meth may now be causing long-term psychosis, similar to schizophrenia, that lasts even after they're not using anymore. I called James Mahoney, a neuropsychologist at West Virginia University, who had studied the effects of ephedrine meth on the brain in the early 2000s at UCLA. The psychosis he saw then was bad, he said, but it frequently appeared to be the result of extended sleep deprivation. In 2016, Mahoney took a job as a drug researcher and specialist in WVU's addiction clinic. Less than a year later, the P2P crystal meth from Mexico started showing up. Mahoney was inundated with meth patients who came in ranting, conversing with phantoms. I can't even compare it to what I was seeing at UCLA, he told me. Now we're seeing it instantaneously, within hours, in people who just used. Psychotic symptoms, hallucinations, delusions. In community after community, I heard stories like this. Southwest Virginia hadn't seen much meth for almost a decade, when suddenly, in about 2017, we started to see people go into the state mental hospital system who were just grossly psychotic. Eric Green, then a drug counselor in the area, told me. Since then, it's caused a crisis in our state mental health hospitals. It's difficult for the truly mentally ill to get care because the facilities are full of people who are on meth. Symptoms could fade once users purged the drug, if they did not relapse. But while they were on this new meth, they grew antisocial, all but mute. I spoke with 2 recovering meth addicts who said they had to relearn how to speak. It took me over a year and a half to recover from the brain damage it had done to me, one of them said. I couldn't hardly form sentences. I couldn't laugh, smile. I couldn't think. I spoke with Jenny Job from rural Morgan County in eastern Tennessee. Job had spent 20 years working in state prisons when she started a drug court and associated residential treatment center in 2013. For its first few years, Job's court handled meth addicts who got their drugs from local shake and bake manufacturers, small batch cooks using Sudafed and usually producing just a few grams of the drug at a time. These meth users were gaunt, she remembers, and picked at their skin, but they were animated, lucid, with memories and personalities intact when they arrived at her facility, detoxed after months in jail. By 2017, however, people were coming to her treatment center stripped of human energy, even after several months spent detoxing from the drug in jail. Normal recreational activities where guys talk trash and have fun, there's none of that. It's like their brain cannot fire. Treating them was daunting. Despite years of research, science has found no equivalent of methadone or Suboxone to help subdue meth cravings and allow people addicted to the drug a chance to break from it and begin repairing their life. And like many others I spoke with, Job found that the human connection essential to successful drug treatment was almost impossible to establish. It takes longer for them to actually be here mentally, Job said. Before, we didn't keep anybody more than 9 months. Now we're running up to 14 months because it's not until 6 or 9 months that we finally find out who we got. Some can't remember their life before jail. It's not unusual for them to ask what they were found guilty of and sentenced to, she said. Why is P2P meth producing such pronounced symptoms of mental illness in so many people? No one I spoke with knew for sure. One theory is that much of the meth contains residue of toxic chemicals used in its production or other contaminants. Even traces of certain chemicals in a relatively pure drug might be devastating. The sheer number of users is up too, and the abundance and low price of P2P meth may enable more continual use among them. That, combined with the drug's potency today, might accelerate the mental deterioration that ephedrine-based meth can also produce, though usually over a period of months or years, not weeks. Meth and opioids, or other drugs, might also interact in particularly toxic ways. I don't know of any study comparing the behavior of users, or rats for that matter, on meth made with ephedrine versus meth made with P2P. This now seems a crucial national question. Once your eyes are open to the scale and human consequences of the P2P meth epidemic, it's hard to miss its ramifications in many areas of American public life. Perhaps the most significant is homelessness. In 2012, a Los Angeles Superior Court judge, Craig Mitchell, founded LA's Skid Row Running Club. Every Monday, Thursday, and Saturday, 20 to 50 people, recovering addicts, cops, public defenders, social workers, meet around dawn in front of a local shelter to run for an hour through the greatest concentration of homeless people in the United States. The club's broader mission is to support the area's homeless community through mentorship and a focus on wellness. Los Angeles has long been the nation's homelessness capital. But as in many cities, large and small, the problem has worsened greatly in recent years. In the LA area, homelessness more than doubled from 2012 to 2020. Mitchell told me the most visible homelessness, people sleeping on sidewalks or in the tents that now crowd many of the city's neighborhoods, was clearly due to the new meth. There was a sea change with respect to meth being the main drug of choice, beginning in about 2008, he said. Now, it's the #1 drug. Remarkably, meth rarely comes up in city discussions on homelessness or in newspaper articles about it. Mitchell called it
My name is Devin Olenick. I'm a superintendent with Moose Jaw Police Service. I'm currently the chair of our crystal meth committee. As a result of that, we're here today filming this video. The Crystal Meth Strategy Committee arose out of a pop-up coffee that was held at Riverview in the spring of, I believe, April 2019. And it came to light as a community event and a community initiative. And at this pop-up coffee, we ended up with about 4 people that spoke about their experiences surrounding their jobs and how it affected the people that they relate to in their jobs, whether it be clients or themselves. The mandate, I think, in its most simplistic form is to provide awareness of crystal meth and provide a level of education about crystal meth so that people are going to be in a position where they can make more logical and hopefully very healthy decisions about crystal meth. The video, I think, is going to be very powerful. First of all, given the time that we're dealing with COVID and the parameters that are placed on all of us from a social aspect as well as a working aspect, we're going to have police people in this video. We're going to have EMS people. We're going to have Saskatchewan health workers, mental health and addictions people. And I think most importantly, we have Megan and Chad who have absolutely volunteered and lent their heart out to us to tell us their personal stories.
Nap time, lunchtime, bedtime. Getting all that done leaves you with
about a decade ago, methamphetamine hit our community here pretty hard. And at that time, it became difficult to find someone whose life had not been impacted by meth in one way or another. Unfortunately, there were some people, of course, who had started using the drug themselves, but there were others who had family members, neighbors, friends, relatives who had gotten involved in it as well. And I'm a treatment provider here in this area. And I noticed that very quickly, the methods that I'd been trained to use were completely ineffective in treating methamphetamine addiction. In fact, I recall an experience of trying to use some of the manual-based approaches. And
we start with a simple question. Does my pet really love me, or does she just want a treat? Obviously, she really loves us. Obviously, right? How do we know what's really going on in those furry little heads? Something is going on. Why is the question always, do they love me? Why is it always about us? Why are we such narcissists? I have a different question. Who are you? That's a better question for animals, I think. We have things going on in our minds that we tend to assume are the exclusive abilities of humans. But there are other brains out there. Some of them are very big. What are they doing with those big brains? Can they think? Can they feel? How can we possibly find a way into that question? Well, there are ways in. We can look at the brain. We can look at evolution.
Thank you. Water is quite beautiful to look at. I guess you probably all know that you're 2/3 water. But you may not know that because the water molecule is so small, that 2/3 translates into 99% of your molecules. Think of it, 99% of your molecules are water. So do your shoes are carrying around a blob of water, essentially. Now, so the question is, in your cell, do those water molecules
molecules actually do something? Are these molecules essentially jobless, or do they do something that might be really, really interesting? And for that matter, are we even really sure that water is H2O? We read about that in the textbook, but is it possible that some water is actually not H2O? So these are questions that whose answers are actually not as simple as you think they might be. In fact, we're really in the dark about water. We know so little. And why do we know so little? Well, you probably think that water is so pervasive. It's such a simple molecule that everything ought to be known about water, right? I mean, you think it's all there. Well, scientists think the same. Many scientists think, oh, water is so simple that everything must be known. And in fact, that's not at all the case. So let me start with a few examples of things about water that we ought to know, but we really haven't a clue. So here's something that you see every day. You see a cloud in the sky. And you haven't asked the question, how does the water get there? Why? I mean, there's only one cloud sitting there, and the water is evaporating everywhere. Why does it go to this cloud? Now, another question, can you imagine droplets floating on water? We expect droplets to coalesce instantly with the water. The droplets persist for a long time. And then here's another example of walking on water. This is a lizard from Central America, and because it walks on water. It's called the Jesus Christ lizard. And of course, you'll say, well, I know the answer to this. The surface tension is high in water. But the common idea of surface tension is that there's a single molecular layer of water at the top. And this single molecular layer is sufficient to create enough tension to hold whatever you put down. I think this is an example that doesn't fit that. And here's another example. 2 beakers of water. You put 2 electrodes in, and you put high voltage between them. And then what happens is a bridge forms. And this bridge is made of water, bridge of water. And this bridge can be sustained as you move one beaker away from the other beaker as much as 4 centimeters. It's sustained essentially indefinitely. How come we don't understand this? So what I mean is that there are lots of things about water that we should understand, but we don't understand. And so we really don't know. So, okay, so what do we know about water? Well, you learn that the water molecule contains an oxygen and 2 hydrogens. That you learn in the textbooks. We know that. And we also know there are many water molecules, and these water molecules are actually moving around microscopically. So we know that. What don't we know about water? Well, we don't know anything about the social behavior of water. What do I mean by social? Well, sitting at the bar and chatting with your neighbor. We don't know how water molecules actually share information or interact. And also, we don't know about the actual movements of water molecules, how water molecules interact with one another, and also how water molecules interact with other molecules like that purple one sitting there. Unknown. Also, the phases of water. Now, we've all learned that there's a solid phase, a liquid phase, and a vapor phase. However, 100 years ago, there was some idea that there might be a 4th phase somewhere in between a solid and a liquid. Sir William Hardy, a famous physical chemist, 100 years ago exactly, professed that there was actually a fourth phase of water, and this water was kind of more ordered than other kinds of water, and in fact had a gel-like consistency. So the question arose to us, all of this was forgotten because people began, as methods improved, to begin to study molecules instead of ensembles of molecules, and people forgot about the collectivity of water molecules and began looking, the same as in biology, began looking at individual molecules and lost sight of the collection. So we thought, we're going to look at this because we had some idea that it's possible that this missing link, this fourth phase, might actually be the missing link so that we can understand the phenomena regarding water that we don't understand. So we started by looking somewhere between a solid and liquid. And the first experiments that we did to get us going, we took a gel, that's the solid, and we put it next to water. And we added some particles to the water because we had the sense that the particles would show us something. And sure enough, you can see that what happened is that the particles began moving away from the interface between the gel and the water, and they just kept moving and moving and moving, and they wound up stopping at a distance that's, roughly the size of one of your hairs. Now that may seem small, but by molecular dimensions, that's practically infinite. It's a huge dimension. So we began studying the properties of this zone, and we called it, for obvious reasons, the exclusion zone, because practically everything you put there would get excluded, would get expelled from the zone as it builds up, or instead of exclusion zone, EZ for short. And so we found that the kinds of materials that would create or nucleate this kind of zone, not just gels, but we found that practically every water-loving or so-called hydrophilic surface could do exactly that, creating the EZ water. And as the EZ water builds, it would expel all the solutes or particles, whatever, into the bulk water. And we began learning about properties, and we've spent now quite a few years looking at the properties. And so it looks something like this. You have a material next to water, and these sheets of EZ layers begin to build, and they build and build, and just keep building up one by one. And so if you look at the structure of each one of these planes, you can see that it's a honeycomb, hexagonal kind of structure, a bit like ice, but not ice. If you look at it carefully, you can see the molecular structure. So of course it consists of hydrogen and oxygen, because it's built from water. But actually, they're not water molecules. If you start counting the number of hydrogens and the number of oxygens, it turns out that it's not H2O. It's actually H3O2. So it is possible that there's water that's not H2O, phase of water. So we began looking, of course, more into these extremely interesting properties. And what we found is we stuck electrodes into the water because we thought there might be some electrical potential. It turned out that there's lots of negative charge in that zone. And we used some dyes to see the positive charge, and we found that in the bulk water zone, there was an equal amount of positivity. So what's going on, it looked like, is that next to these interfaces, the water molecule is somehow splitting up into a negative part and a positive part. And the negative part sat right next to the water-loving material, and the positive charges went out beyond that. We found, actually, it's the same. You didn't need a straight interface. You could also have a sphere. So you put a sphere in the water, and any sphere that's suspended in the water develops one of these exclusion zones, EZs around it, with the negative charge. And beyond that is all the positive charge separation. It didn't have to be only a material sphere. In fact, you could put a droplet in there, a water droplet, or in fact, even a bubble. You get the same result. Surrounding each one of these entities is a negative charge and the separated positive charge. So here's a question for you. If you take two of these negatively charged entities and you drop them in a beaker of water near each other, what happens to the distance between them? Now, I bet that 95% of you would say Well, that's easy. I learned in physics, negative and negative repel each other. So therefore, they're going to go apart from one another, right? Is that what you guess? Well, the actual result, if you think about it, is that it's not only the positive charge, negative charge, but you also have positive charge. And the positive charge is especially concentrated in between those two spheres because they come from contributions from both of those spheres. So there are a lot of them there. When you have positive in between two negatives, what happens is that you get an attractive force. And so you expect these two spheres to actually come together despite the fact that they have the same charge. And that's exactly what happens. It's been known for many years. They come together, and if you have many of them instead of just two of them, you'll get something that looks like this. They'll come together, and this is called a colloid crystal. It's a stable structure. In fact, the yogurt that you might have had this morning probably consists of what you see right here. So they come together because of the opposite charge. The same thing is true if you have droplets. They come together because of the opposing charges. So when you think of droplets, aerosol droplets in the air, and think about the cloud, it's actually the reason that these aerosol droplets come together is because of this opposite charge. So the droplets from the air, similarly charged, come together, coalesce, giving you that cloud in the sky. So the fourth phase, or easy phase, actually explains quite a lot. It explains, for example, the cloud. And the cloud, it's the positive charge that draws these negatively charged easy shells together to give you a condensed cloud that you see up in the sky. In terms of the water droplets, the reason that these are sustained on the surface for actually sometimes as long as tens of seconds, you can see it. If you're in a boat and it's raining, you can sometimes see this on the surface of the lake. These droplets are sustained for some time. The reason they're sustained is that each droplet contains this shell, this easy shell. And the shell has to be breached in order for the water to coalesce with the water beneath. Now, in terms of the Jesus Christ lizard, the reason the lizard could walk is not because of one single molecular layer, but there are many easy layers lining the surface, and these are gel-like. They're stiffer than ordinary surfaces. So therefore, you can float a coin on the surface of the water, you can float a paper clip, although if you put it beneath the surface, it sinks right down to the bottom because of that. And in terms of the water bridge, if you think of it as plain old liquid bulk water, hard to understand. But if you think of it as easy water and the gel-like character, then you can understand how it could be sustained with almost no droop, a very stiff structure. Okay, so all well and good, but why is this useful for us? What can we do with it? Well, we can get energy from water. In fact, the energy that we can get from water is free energy. It's literally free. We can take it from the environment. Let me explain. So you have a situation in the diagram with negative charge and positive charge. And when you have two opposing charges next to each other, it's like a battery. So really we have essentially a battery made of water. A battery made of water. And of course you can extract charge from it. So that is the right now. Batteries run down like your cell phone doesn't need to be plugged in every day or two. And so the question is, well, what charges this water battery? It took us a while to figure that out. Battery. And one day we're doing an experiment, and a student in the lab walks by, and he has his lamp. And he takes the lamp, he shines it on where the light was shining. And that the exclusion zone grew by leaps and bounds. So we thought, aha, it looks like light. And in many experiments you show that the energy for building this comes from light. It comes not only from direct light, but also indirect light. What do I mean by indirect light? Well, what I mean is that indirect light is, for example, infrared light that exists all over this auditorium. If we were to turn on all the lights, including the floodlights, and I pulled out my infrared camera and looked at the audience, you'd see a very clear, bright image. And if I looked at the walls, you'd see a very clear image. And the reason for that is that everything is giving off infrared energy. You're giving off infrared energy. That's the energy that's most effective in building this charge separation in this fourth phase. So in other words, you have a material, you have water, and you collect energy from outside. And as you collect the energy from outside, the exclusion zone builds. And if you take away that extra energy, it'll go back to its normal size. So this battery is basically charged by light, by the sun. It's a gift from the sun. If you think about it, what's going